Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our weekly roundup of the main stories on Palestine and the wider region from the past week. As always, I am joined by Mouin Rabbani to discuss all those key stories. Hello, Mouin, and thank you for joining us again.
Hi, Nassim, and thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure.
As always, likewise. Uh, we'll begin with the hostage deal. At one point, it seemed like it was going to collapse. I think when we recorded the show last Monday, we discussed that it was Hamas had said that it would not continue with the hostage deal. Then it was revived again. So, what really happened? Did Hamas call Israel's bluff? Did Netanyahu cave? So, I want to get your thoughts on that. And then we'll discuss some of the other key stories from the hostage deal, especially the images of the prisoners that were released by Israel. Then there's a shocking story of a 80-year-old Palestinian man who was used as a human shield. We'll discuss that as well. Then we'll turn to Trump's outrageous plan to ethnically cleanse Gaza. And there's been a lot of regional response from that, including by the UAE ambassador to Washington. So we'll get your thoughts on that, and also then we'll end, I guess, with the Munich conference, where European leaders have reacted, I would say, with fury at JD Vance's speech in Germany. So let's begin, though, as I said, with the hostage deal. We ended last week, as I mentioned, with Hamas issuing a statement saying that it was not going to release the hostage. But then a lot of things happened over the week. Uh, Netanyahu issued threats, as did Donald Trump. But in the end, the release of hostages did take place on Saturday. So what exactly happened? Did Hamas call Israel's bluff? Did Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the end cave to pressure? What exactly happened?
Well, I think we should start with a general observation that Israel has habitually, over the decades, always tried to revise the terms of agreements that has accepted, and additionally try to implement agreements it has accepted in ways that differ often fundamentally from what's been put in writing. And we're seeing this now, for example, very clearly with Lebanon, where the ceasefire agreement reached at the end of last year explicitly stated that Israel would withdraw all its troops from Lebanese territory within 60 days. It then received a bilateral extension, in other words, authorization from the United States to maintain a presence in Lebanon until the 18th of February. And this is nowhere in the agreement. This was simply a bilateral agreement between Israel and the US, completely ignoring Lebanon, and was then basically communicated to the Lebanese by the United States. And now Israel is insisting that it will not withdraw from Lebanon on the 18th of February because it will maintain five outposts within Lebanese territory, one presumes indefinitely. And of course, if Hezbollah or the Lebanese army or any other Lebanese party so much as throws a pebble at occupying Israeli troops, it will be this that will be considered a violation of the ceasefire rather than Israel's refusal to abide by its terms. So, if we look now specifically at Palestine and the agreement that was reached in the Gaza Strip, it's not actually a hostage exchange agreement. It's much broader than that. And at Israel's insistence, it did not it did not consist of a comprehensive ceasefire and a comprehensive exchange of captives shortly after the agreement was signed, but rather a three-stage agreement. And if I can just briefly recapitulate, the
Mm.
first stage calls for a suspension of hostilities, a limited exchange of captives between Israel and the Palestinians, a surge in humanitarian supplies entering the Gaza Strip, and authorization for forcibly displaced Palestinians to return to whatever is left of their homes, primarily from the central and southern regions of the Gaza Strip to its north. Now, what happened last week is that Israel has uh, basically refused to comply with any of the specific what do you call it? Any of the specific terms that it agreed to regarding the entry of humanitarian supplies, and particularly of tents and caravans, which are urgently needed in midwinter in the Gaza Strip, because most of these forcibly displaced Palestinians, and indeed most Palestinians who have not been forcibly displaced from their homes, no longer have homes and urgently require these tents and caravans. And Israel has allowed in only a limited number of tents and no caravans. So, on this basis, Hamas last Monday announced that it was indefinitely suspending any further exchange of captives unless and until Israel complied with its commitments under this agreement. You then had first U.S. President Trump saying not only that Hamas would be punished if it didn't comply with its agreements, on the commitments rather under this agreement, but Hamas was called upon to exceed its commitments. In other words, to release all remaining Israeli captives, not just those that were agreed upon, and to release all of them by high noon last Saturday. Then Netanyahu chipped in, made similar threats that the war, Israel's genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip, would resume with intensified ferocity if Hamas did not comply. And Hamas basically said, we're not going to do anything unless and until Israel meets its own obligations. And we then began to see images of caravans and so on moving into the Egyptian crossing into the Gaza Strip. Now, I'm unclear about the details. We do know that no caravans entered the Gaza Strip from Egypt. I suspect none entered either from crossing points controlled by Israel. So we can make two conclusions. On the one hand, Hamas stood firm and called Israel's bluff and refused to do more than the exchange of captives that had been agreed upon in writing in the ceasefire agreement. But simultaneously, it also appears that Hamas got played in the sense that it appears to have received assurances from the mediators via Israel that these housing units, the tents and the caravans, would be permitted to enter the Gaza Strip. They indeed moved towards the border, but then did not enter the Gaza Strip. So, once again, Israel, the fundamental problem here is that Israel is seeking, once again, to revise the terms of an agreement that it has agreed upon in writing and to revise the terms of its implementation. And regarding this week, Israel is once again demanding that Hamas release more corpses and more captives than what had previously been agreed upon in exchange for Israel meeting its existing commitments under the agreement. So we'll see how that played out. But I think the general conclusion one can draw is that Israel is seeking to drag its feet. It's seeking to maximize its own benefits from this agreement while minimizing those of its adversaries, and this within the broader context of seeking to prevent a transition of this agreement from its first phase to a second phase, which includes a durable ceasefire. And if I could just make one last point, here I think, as we've discussed repeatedly. It's the position of the U.S. which is crucial. And the problem here is that we're getting mixed signals from different U.S. officials. We had Secretary of State Marco Rubio in Israel meeting with Netanyahu and basically endorsing Netanyahu's views regarding the future of this agreement, lock, stock, and barrel. Then you have Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, saying that the U.S. is committed to the full implementation of this agreement and to the successful conclusion of negotiations about the details of the agreement's second phase. So it's kind of like, a juggler throwing multiple balls up into the air and seeing which is easiest to catch.
I think we'll discuss some of those points in more detail later on. But sticking with the ceasefire for now, phase one is going to last for 6 weeks, so we're 4 weeks in. There's 2 more weeks, and as you mentioned, Netanyahu is dragging his feet. Israel's procrastinating. It seems like they're looking for ways to break the ceasefire or some kind of a excuse to break the ceasefire and not enter into phase two or expand phase one if they can. Um, Ultimately, given they now have an endorsement from US President Joe Biden, sorry, Donald Trump, US President Donald Trump, to ethnically cleanse Gaza. So they want to basically return to war in Gaza and ultimately to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians because they have the endorsement of Donald Trump. So, can you see in the next 2 weeks when phase one comes to an end and phase two begins? I think they're negotiating phase two now, where the ceasefire ultimately collapses because, as I said, Netanyahu is seeking to return to hostilities, return to bombarding Gaza as he was doing for the past 16 months. So, do you expect phase two to actually begin? I know you mentioned there's mixed messages from the US, but ultimately it's in Netanyahu's interest to make sure we don't enter into phase two. If he is not unable to expand phase one, then find some reason to justify returning to collapsing the ceasefire deal and returning to war.
Well, it's a very good question that's easier posed than answered because, as you correctly point out, you have Trump's Gaza ethnic cleansing proposal, which makes any agreement in whatever phase completely meaningless and irrelevant. But then you also have the Americans simultaneously pushing for not only the completion of phase one, but pushing for successful negotiations in order to see the implementation of phase two. And on the Israeli side, there seems to be more Israeli public pressure on the Israeli government to complete the implementation of an agreement that is already in force compared to previously, where there was more limited Israeli public pressure on the government to reach an agreement that had not yet been consummated. So it's a bit of a labyrinth for Netanyahu as well, and all indications are that the way that the Israeli government will try to resolve this conundrum is not to simply abrogate and derail the agreement and immediately return to full-scale war, nor to negotiate seriously about the second phase. But what it will try to do is to extend the first phase, which, from Israel's perspective, means you have additional releases of captives, which meets both an Israeli and Israeli public interest and an American one as well, because the Americans have repeatedly stated that they're committed to seeing every last captive from the Gaza Strip retrieved. But at the same time, you won't have an agreement on a durable ceasefire, and Israel can then invent whatever pretext at whatever point to simply resume its genocidal military campaign. The problem with this scenario is that Hamas and the Palestinians And more broadly seen, the Arab states and the mediators, particularly Egypt and Qatar, have a say in the matter as well. And I consider it unlikely that Hamas is simply going to continue with weekly exchanges of captives for another 6 or 7 or whatever weeks without Israel meeting its own commitments, whether under the first stage or as far as negotiating and concluding the second stage is concerned. And so these contradictions, you can imagine it's not inconceivable, that Hamas will not call Israel's bluff and fold for whatever reason. But I think the more likely scenario is that Hamas will stand its ground and Israel will then use Hamas's insistence on implementing the agreement as it was ratified. In other words, refusing to extend the first stage of the agreement at the expense of the second stage. It will seek to use this as a pretext to derail the agreement. And it's then that the Americans will have to make a decision. They will either need to instruct Israel to implement the agreement more or less as it was agreed, or they will authorize the Israelis to derail the agreement and return to their genocidal military campaign, which could then have broader consequences in the region and not just in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank.
Turning to the actual hostages that were released, there wasn't the outrage as we saw last week about the actual health conditions of the hostages that were released by Hamas. But this week there was a lot of images of Palestinians that were released who were clearly abused. They were malnourished and really gaunt. And as a result of that, there was a discussion on social media, many pointing out, pro-Israelis pointing out that, the Israelis are hostages, the Palestinians are prisoners who are in detention because of vile criminal offenses. That isn't exactly true, though, is it? I mean, a lot of these Palestinians are held in administrative detention, meaning Israel is holding them without any justification whatsoever. So, so can you comment on that? I mean, this idea that these Palestinians are all prisoners and Israel is releasing prisoners. A lot of these are not prisoners. They're actually held hostage by Israel, and Israel is abusing them in prison. And we also saw this week the case of ongoing case of Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya, who was also reportedly tortured in Israeli detention as well. This is the doctor who was kidnapped, I think, now nearly 2 months ago. So Palestinian prisoners, hostages, if you want to call them, they do face abuse and discrimination of all kinds under Israeli prison.
Well, there's a lot to say about that, and let me just repeat something we discussed last week, is that the conduct of one party, no matter how egregious, cannot justify misconduct or similar conduct by another party. We spoke last week about how international law is unambiguously clear that taking civilian non-combatants captive makes them into hostages and is by definition illegal, even if you treat them very well. Regarding what's happening in Israel's prison system, there's absolutely no comparison. And that's for several reasons. First of all, as the International Court of Justice determined last year, the occupation is illegal. It is unlawful, it is illegitimate, and it must be brought to a conclusion as rapidly as possible. Secondly, Palestinians do have the right to resist that occupation, and indeed to resist that occupation with armed force, provided they adhere to the laws of war. Third of all, many of these prisoners who have been tried and who have been convicted are essentially tried and convicted in kangaroo courts. They're not they're not put on trial in anything that any normal human being would recognize as a court of law. These are kangaroo courts. These are Israeli military courts, which have something like a 98 or 99% conviction rate. So their verdicts and their sentences are absolutely meaningless and farcical. And then there are several additional aspects, which is that you know, quite apart from kind of the torture and mistreatment and all these other issues that have been going on for decades, since October 7th, under the instructions of Israel's now resigned national security minister, the far-right neo-fascist Kahanist, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Israel as an official policy, instituted a prison regime which was designed to starve, to systematically torture, to humiliate, to abuse, and so on, all the prisoners and detainees in its custody. And we've spoken previously about many cases of rape of prisoners as an instrument of policy, of televised gang rape of prisoners, and indeed, this has a wide social base. There were riots in Israel with the participation of members of parliament and others, basically uh, in support of the right of these prison wardens to rape Palestinian detainees. And under international law, a hostage is a civilian non-combatant who is detained for the purpose of putting pressure on the other party for whatever reason. And under that definition, the majority of Palestinians, particularly those detained from the Gaza Strip who have not faced any charge or trial or conviction, qualify by definition as hostages. And of course, there are thousands more such Palestinian cases than there are Israeli ones in the Gaza Strip. So we need to bear in mind this general context before then turning to the specific cases of these Palestinians that are being released as part of this Israeli-Palestinian agreement. And every week, of those who are released, some have to be rushed straight to hospital to receive urgent medical attention because medical attention is being deliberately deprived as a matter of policy by the Israeli authorities. Last week when these three gaunt Israeli captives were released, Israel flunkies and their apologists, and of course Israeli officials were comparing them to Holocaust survivors, an absolutely absurd comparison at multiple levels. But it's worth pointing out this week the first instance of prisoners being compelled to wear a Star of David since 1945 were not the Israeli captives in the Gaza Strip, but rather they were the hundreds of Palestinian detainees that were released this week, many of them hostages, as I just pointed out. And they were forced to wear T-shirts with Stars of David, with the slogan "Never forget, never forgive." One of them had his leg amputated in prison, and we've spoken before about how many surgeries are being conducted in the Israeli prison system without anesthetic, how untrained or insufficiently trained medical students are being invited to essentially train upon the bodies of these detainees and to conduct medical experiments upon them. So, you can make the argument that comparisons with the Holocaust and with Dr. Mengele and so on are are not really applicable to the situation of the past year. That's perfectly fine. But if one insists on making such comparisons, it's indisputably obvious where that comparison lies, and it's not concerning the captives in the Gaza Strip. Absolutely not.
And one of the strange comments I read, again from another influential Israeli commentator, was that the reason Hamas was looking to suspend the hostage deal was because all the other hostages were in a much worse state than the three that were released last week. And therefore, having seen the global backlash against that, they were looking for a pretext and a reason to cancel the hostage deal entirely. Again, turned out to be false. That's not the case. You know, it was genuinely the case that Israel was not abiding by its obligations under the deal. That's clearly what it turns out to be. And talking about wearing the Star of David, again, there's another really horrific story last week of Israel forcing an 80-year-old Palestinian man to wear explosives around his neck. And again, most mainstream media have ignored that. It's a textbook case of using human shield, and not, the way most Western media describe Hamas as using human shield. I mean, that's not a textbook case. This is clearly a textbook case of Israelis taking a Palestinian man, in this case, 80-year-old Palestinian man, putting explosive around his neck to be used as a human shield. So many have described this and others as examples of Israelis using Palestinians as human baits to lure Palestinians and then shoot them or kill them. So, what do we know more about this latest instance of Israel using Palestinians as human shield?
Well, of course, Israel and its apologists and flunkies have from the very outset been claiming that, the entire population, Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip is essentially being forced to function as a collective human shield for Hamas. And they use this as a pretext to systematically destroy hospitals and the health infrastructure, to systematically destroy the educational sector, all universities and many schools, more than 65% of the housing stock, and so on. And whenever Israel is questioned about these activities, they repeat this mantra: human shield, human shield, human shield, which really there's been no evidence offered by Israel apart from, some cartoon graphics and so on. Human shield has a very specific definition under international law, and that is where a military force coerces civilians in order to conduct operations on its behalf, or coerces them into kind of serving as a shield between itself and an opposing military force. So, the idea that Al Ahli Hospital, Al Shifa Hospital, Al Auda Hospital, and all these others were functioning as kind of Hamas command centers. Well, that would be a case of human shielding, except that today Israel has offered 0.00 evidence for its claims. Again, apart from a few graphics that turned out to have no basis in reality. But as far as Israel's conduct is concerned, it has been coercing Palestinian civilians to serve as human shields according to the very specific definition of human shielding under international law for many, many years. It used to do this systematically in the West Bank. Israeli soldiers even had a name for it. It was called the neighborhood procedures, where they would arbitrarily grab a civilian from the street, force him to enter a building where they suspected armed militants might be hiding, either in order to see if they're going to shoot, so that it's not them, or to communicate with those armed militants and call upon them to surrender or whatever. And in fact, human rights organizations took such cases to the Supreme Court, and it's on record that the Israeli military went to the Israeli Supreme Court arguing for its right to continue with this practice of using Palestinian civilians arbitrarily grabbed from the streets as human shields. If we now turn specifically to Israel's genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip since October 2023. Already in late 2023, well over a year ago, we began to receive reports. There was one already, I think, in late November of 23 or perhaps early December, put forward by the Palestinian Journalist Syndicate in the Gaza Strip of a Palestinian who basically his family was detained and he was told if he didn't do as he's told, they would be killed. And he was sent into a tunnel with explosives around his neck. There have been many, many more cases of this reported. So this incident you're referring to is just the latest in a very long line of such sordid incidents. In this case, a 80-year-old Palestinian man was forced to function as a human shield by the Israeli military for several hours. Or several days, I can't recall. I believe it was several hours. He was subsequently released, after which he and his wife were shot dead by the Israeli military, presumably by snipers. Now, one can imagine the international outrage by, European politicians who love wagging their finger at anything and everything, or by uh, Western media organizations and so on, if it had been Israelis put in this position, but when it's Palestinians, who cares? They don't have names. They don't have pasts, presents, future. They don't have family members who are all interviewed. They don't have friends. We aren't given a comprehensive biography of who they were, how they lived their lives, how everyone who ever knew them felt about them, and so on. These are just, two more anonymous corpses that are virtually immediately forgotten.
And we will return to the topic of the consequences of the dehumanization of Palestinians, not just the destruction of Gaza and the West Bank and the genocide against Palestinians, but also in the West, what that leads to with reports of a Jewish man attacking two other Israelis thinking they were Palestinians in Miami. So we'll get to that story later on, but these are the real consequences of the dehumanization of Palestinians, genocide, and on top of that, many other things. But before we do that, I want to get your thoughts on two reports this week. Again, just illustrating the brutality and the genocidal nature of Israel's assault on Gaza over the past 16 months. First is a report by Lancet, which found that Gaza's life expectancy had dropped from 75.5 years to 40 years over the past 16 months. And also a really long article by Alex DeWall measuring on the London Review of Books, measuring famine in Gaza. DeWall provides detailed analysis showing how Israel has deliberately used starvation as a weapon of war against the Palestinians. And on top of that, it has been manipulating access to food and at the same time trying to avoid having global institution designating the situation in Gaza as a famine. So comment on either of those two reports, both if you want, Moin.
Well, again, I think these reports are significant, not only in and of themselves, but also in the broader context of the systematic genocide denial that we've been seeing over the course of the past year and a half. As I'm sure you're familiar with, um, uh, Israel apologists and flunkies love putting forward this population projection that was produced by an international organization. I can't remember, perhaps the World Bank or some other organization,
Mm.
prior to October 7th, projecting a population increase in the Gaza Strip over 2024. And this is presented of, well, if there's a genocide, how come there's more Palestinians in the Gaza Strip today than there were on October 7th? Of course, completely and deliberately ignoring that this is a population projection that was put forward from before the genocide commenced. As far as Israel's siege and policy of starvation and famine and so on in the Gaza Strip is concerned, they'll find some arbitrary picture of a Palestinian, preferably a woman who appears overweight, and ceaselessly body shame her to say, starvation, what starvation, and so on. Very crude and vulgar tactics, but then again, so is genocide denial. What we have here are these two reports that directly speak to the genocide denial. First of all, this study in the Lancet, which shows, which is the leading British medical journal and is considered among the most prestigious medical journals on the planet, demonstrating that since October 7th, life expectancy in the Gaza Strip, for a long list of reasons, has decreased, I believe, by almost half. And this will, of course, be summarily dismissed by Israel and its flunkies. The Lancet is anti-Semitic. It's run by neo-Nazis and jihadists, and the authors have a vested interest, and they'll try to find anything to dismiss this scientific study and its scientific conclusions. The other report you mentioned, actually a lengthy article in the London Review of Books, is by Alex Deval, who is considered one of the leading authorities on hunger and has written extensively on hunger in other parts of the world. In other words, he is not someone who discovered the study of hunger and starvation through the lens of Israel's genocide. He's been working on these issues for many, many years, and primarily in other locations. And he reaches a conclusion that what Israel has done in the Gaza Strip can really only be compared to what's known as the Hunger Winter in the Netherlands in 1944, the final year of the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands, and the siege of Leningrad during the Second World War. That is really a mind-blowing conclusion. Don't take my word for it. Read his article. It's freely accessible on the website of the London Review of Books. And if you're not satisfied with his own conclusions, well, he mobilizes sufficient sources for reaching these conclusions that can also be freely consulted.
Yeah, and going back to the issue of genocide and population, I mean, you could easily point to statistics and say that Stalin cannot be accused of genocide because the Soviet Union population increased under his reign. You could take 2 points in time and say, look, population increased, therefore Stalin cannot be accused of genocide. But Stalin is, along with Hitler, the biggest mass murderer of the 20th century. No one's going to say, he didn't commit genocide because the Soviet Union, in parts, the population went up. It just doesn't make any sense.
Well, I mean,
And
it's the equivalent of saying, denying that there was a Holocaust, because if there was, how could there possibly have been a Jewish state established 3 years later? It's
yeah.
absurd. It has a very specific name. It's called genocide denial. Full stop.
Hmm. Let's shift gears and move on to what we should by now call the Trump plan. I think if this plan is executed, it will uh, be a massive stain on Americans, which is the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, literally. And Trump is endorsing that. We've spoken about that last week. There's been a really furious debate and discussion following that, even within the Arab states. Uh, but the first state that seems to have blinked on this issue is the UAE, the ambassador of the UAE. What's his name? In Washington,
Yusuf al-Utaiba.
Civil Table. So he gave an interview basically endorsing the Trump plan, saying there doesn't seem to be any other option. We've tried everything, and this
No
is the only one
alternative.
on the table. So why not go with that? Even though we haven't tried everything, we haven't tried the two-state solution, we haven't tried actually putting pressure on Israel, we haven't tried the so-called the Arab Initiative of 2002. There's so many other things you can say we haven't tried, but they seem to be suggesting because we haven't tried anything, we can go for ethnic cleansing, and then the key date seems to be at the moment now is the one the Arabs states are coming following a summit, they will endorse some kind of an Arab plan. And the report is that the UAE is not going to go to this summit unless there's a shift in the language from we categorically reject any displacements of Palestinians from Gaza to we categorically reject any forced displacements of Palestinians from Gaza. So UAE is trying to, somehow push the or make the uh, Trump plan a bit more sane. And many have said that there's a sane washing that's going on with President Trump. He says something crazy, and others sane wash, like we have,
I like that term.
sports washing or cultural washing. We now have sane washing of Trump plans, and we sane washing literally a genocidal plan, and the UAE seems to be endorsing that. Of course, other Arab countries like Egypt have said that they will offer a comprehensive plan which will keep Gazans in Gaza and not endorse any kind of displacement. Just your thoughts over the past week about
Well,
the response to the Trump plan, and also
well,
Yusuf al-Otaiba coming out and saying what he did.
Well, several observations. I mean, Yusuf al-Ateba could have started by saying that it's precisely because of the policies pursued by his own government and other autocracies in the Arab world that have gotten us to the point where such a harebrained scheme could even be proposed, let alone endorsed by him. That would be my first observation. Second observation is that the UAE seems to be putting forward multiple positions. You know, their ambassador to the US says something to stroke the US ego. Other Emirati officials in Abu Dhabi and so on take different positions in order to speak to their own public opinion. Emirati officials involved in multilateral discussions with other Arab states take a harder line, and so on. And then a third observation I would make is that this idea of voluntary expulsion is a hoax. Basically, you create situations that leave people with absolutely no alternatives except death or departure. And if they depart simply to preserve their own lives, then you put out the lie that this is a voluntary departure. It would be a bit like Otaiba being recalled to Abu Dhabi and removed from his post, and then saying, well, he voluntarily left his sinecure in Washington, D.C. But I think ultimately, the real story here and the real issue has to do with Saudi Arabia. As you know, in recent decades, the smaller Gulf states, Qatar, the UAE, Oman, to an extent, have increasingly emerged from Saudi Arabia's shadow, which basically used to rule the roost unquestioned, and have developed increasingly autonomous regional and international policies. Here we have a situation where Saudi Arabia has made quite clear, at least in its statements, that it considers the Trump plan, and particularly Netanyahu's polemical addition to it, of if the Saudis really want a Palestinian state, they can establish one in their own territory, that Saudi Arabia has approached this plan, at least publicly, as a direct threat to its national security and to its stability. That one would expect would mean that Saudi Arabia will ensure that the other Gulf states, where they prove recalcitrant, fall into line and join in a categorical rejection of the Trump scheme and line up behind any alternative. So if either the Arab League final communique is watered down to replace forced relocation with voluntary relocation. You know, a similar meaningless distinction made, by the way, by Antony Blinken when he was trying to market something similar in late 2023. If we see such a change of wording, or if we have a situation where the wording is maintained and not changed to satisfy the United Arab Emirates, but the Emiratis then boycott the Arab League summit. That will mean basically that the Saudis did not consider it sufficiently important to use the leverage they indisputably have over the United Arab Emirates to ensure that it adheres to the Gulf and Arab consensus.
Uh, and on that topic, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal. Again, this goes back to what I was saying about sane washing Trump's idea. The writer is of Indian origin, I think. He said that if during the partition,
The
Indians moved
partition of
to
India.
Pakistan. Yeah,
Mm.
British Indians moved to Pakistan, and many Pakistani Hindus moved to India. Why can't we have something similar in this situation? Forgetting the fact that 2 million people were massacred during the partition, and he's
Well, that's
presenting the death
probably
of two
something
million.
to recommend it to to Israel and its apologists.
Yeah, it's presenting the death of a model which led to the death of 2 million people as a model to be replicated in Israel Palestine. So, this is again another crazy world we're living where we're sane washing, ethnic cleansing, and genocide, and it's offered as reasonable argument in places like the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere. And again, it goes, I think, deep down at the root of it all. This is the dehumanization of Palestinians, which is what I want to return to, and it's related to a story in the U.S. Where a Zionist Jew by the name of Mordechai Brafman, who reportedly went hunting for Palestinians. He ended up shooting two Israelis thinking they were Palestinians in Miami Beach. So the interesting thing is that the victims now claim that this was an anti-Semitic attack, even though the shooter was Jewish Zionist, and he went out of his. I mean, he went to kill clearly Palestinians. Both the victims then went on social media calling for death to Arabs, and 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 um, and I mean, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So try and make it make sense for us,
You know, if
sorry, go on.
yeah, if some um, mentally disturbed documentary maker had or film director had put such a scenario into a movie, it would have been dismissed as being completely unrealistic. But here you have a situation. I believe the shooter was a fanatic American Jew and not an
Yeah.
Israeli.
Well,
Probably
call them
couldn't
a Zionist. Why
distinguish.
can't we call
Excuse
them
me?
Zionist? Why can't we just call them Zionist or
Well,
Jews radicalized by
I'm
Zionism?
asking because this lunatic probably couldn't distinguish between Arabic and Hebrew.
Yeah.
Heard these two swarthy looking individuals speaking Hebrew, assumed they were Palestinians, and that for him was sufficient reason to kill them. And in fact, he went and he shot both these people, and then claimed that he had killed two Palestinians. Um, So, this was an attack motivated purely by anti-Palestinian genocidal racism. The idea that on the streets of Miami, you just go and shoot and kill two people in broad daylight because you suspect they're Palestinians. And then the victims, who turned out to be two Israeli Jews, um, denounce this attack, which is indisputably and unambiguously motivated by genocidal anti-Palestinian racism. They denounce it as an anti-Semitic attack, and their response to it is death to the Arabs.
Yeah.
It requires absolute craziness to even imagine such scenarios, but they're now reality. And even more so is how little attention they have received in the US mainstream media. I mean, imagine if um, uh, a Palestinian, whether Muslim or Christian, had singled out two Jews and shot at them simply because he suspected they were Jewish or that he suspected they were Israeli Jews. My God, I mean, it would be the only thing we would talk about for the next 8 months.
Hmm. And Musk would be tweeting
Yes,
continuously. He shot at them 17 times. And I just, when I look at this story, I just think, that the dehumanization of Palestinians is so
it's
complete that,
completely normalized.
yeah,
Completely normalized.
even when they're hunted by, I would say, in this case, a radicalized Zionist, their victimhood cannot be acknowledged. It still has to be anti-Semitism, and
Yes.
that's the response. And and when I look at stories like that, I just think, Zionism has been the most radicalizing ideology in the history of Judaism since the first century, when the group of Jews known as zealots who carried out terrorist attack against the Romans, for which they were expelled. I don't think there has been a more extreme Jewish ideology uh, in between the 2000 years. So this is why you end up with people like that doing what they do, which is to go out hunting Palestinians, mistaking Jews for Palestinians. And it has to be called out and said that Zionism is a radical ideology which radicalizes Jews into carrying out these kind of barbaric acts. I think it needs to be said. Um, to end with, I want to go to another big story from last week, which is from Europe. Um, I don't know. I think let's go to Starmer first, the UK, where the British government and the Tories discussed Palestinian asylum seekers, and there was a case last week where a Palestinian family was allowed, given permission to enter into the UK. And this caused an uproar. Both Starmer and the opposition, Tory opposition, they said now they will seek to close any loophole which is in the UK judicial system that allows Palestinians to seek asylum in the UK. So this asylum system exists for Ukrainians, but somehow the Palestinians were able to come via that means. The judge allowed them, gave them permission. Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, came out and said that the judge was actually wrong to allow the Palestinians to return. And 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 to a lot of people, that's quite an outrage because why why not allow Palestinians to come to the UK in the same way you allow Ukrainians to come to the UK via the same system, especially given that the UK, under many people's eyes, have a much greater role and responsibility towards the Palestinians than they do with the Ukrainians. Let's not forget that it's the UK who has a historical role in creating the state of Israel and being complicit in the ongoing occupation and the genocide, the current genocide in Gaza. So, despite all the historical baggage, the UK simply said we cannot. We have to close the loopholes to allow Palestinians to come to the UK, while at the same time allowing Ukrainians to come to the UK. So this is a clear example of racism, many would say. Just get your thoughts on that.
Well, it demonstrates once again that Keir Starmer is not only a passionate Zionist, but an unreconstructed white supremacist. This Palestinian family from the Gaza Strip used an asylum procedure that was created for Ukrainian refugees to join their family in Great Britain. The judge who looked at this case was fully aware of all the details. It's not as if he allowed them to come because he overlooked something or that there was some egregious oversight on his part. He looked in detail at the case. He was fully aware of how they had applied, but concluded that their case was unanswerable and they should be given, I think it's called leave to remain in Great Britain. Starmer has been trying to set himself up as kind of a competitor of not only the Tories, but of Reform UK, Nigel Farage's party. That, you know, if you really want to go after refugees, if you are genuinely an anti-immigrant, well, then vote Labour. Not for the Tories or Reform, who only talk the talk, but it's only Labour that walks the walk. And so, of course, you know, when you're trying to demonstrate your white supremacist credentials, what better than to use Palestinians as your battering ram, as your stalking horse? You know, because then you also ingratiate yourself with the Zionist factions of the opposition.
And finally, to J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, which has left Europeans seething and fuming at his censorious speech, wagging his finger at the Europeans, telling them, you know, you guys are threatening democracy. And of course, he made a number of there were a number of other announcements by other US officials about Russia. And it's and the tone seemed to be very much the the US is stepping down from its role as a leader of the so-called free world and the guarantor of the so-called rules-based order. Um, and of course, in that kind of scenario, the US, being what it is, a major superpower, will still continue to remain the biggest threat to global peace. Many would argue, by the sheer fact that it is, even if it withdraws, it's the biggest, one of the most powerful country in the world. But what does that mean in terms of the Middle East? If the US is, as Vance and the US Defense Secretary Hegseth has announced at the security conference, what do these announcements mean for the Middle East and Palestine? Well, I assume, Palestine is the exception to US withdrawal. That seems to be the message so far. What's your thought?
Well, as long as the U.S. doesn't put its money where its mouth is, there's no reason to take them seriously. You know, we had the pivot to Asia, which ended up being a pivot to Israel. We now have this latest screed by J.D. Vance. Um, Again, I think it's basically a rhetorical device. To try to put the Europeans in their place and provide sustenance to the European far right, which of course is part of the pet project of Elon apartheid Musk and other elements of the Trump administration, particularly with the German elections around the corner. I'll just make one comment about Vance's Munich speech, which is that he went on and on and on about free speech and how the Europeans were suppressing this and so on. Well, for God's sake, he was speaking in Germany, where it's now illegal to speak in the Arabic language at demonstrations. I mean, that in and of itself is a punishable offense. Did he say anything about that? Did he say anything about what really is the real threat to free speech in Germany and in Europe generally, which is the growing and increasingly violent and increasingly legalized repression of pro-Palestinian or anti-genocide and anti-Israeli speech? Did he bother to compare his own country's record on these issues? At Columbia University in the US, there's now a WhatsApp group composed of Columbia faculty, parents, and others who were seeking to identify individual students who are foreign citizens who they want expelled from the university and deported from the United States because they're opposed to Israel's genocide. And Vance sets himself up as kind of a representative of the values of free speech. It's absurd.
Mm. And to add to that, there are dozens of US states, the majority of US states, where they have a Israel loyalty test. If you want government contracts, if you want to work for the government in any shape or form, you have to sign a document which
Yeah.
requires your loyalty to Israel. So this is the country.
Charity begins at home.
Yeah, exactly. Mouin, as ever, it was a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you,
We'll
Nassim.
come back again soon and do another roundup of the key events of the Middle East. Thank you very much. Speak to you soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.